Welcome everyone. My name is Terry Leventhal. I'm the director of the Coburn Association, and we're delighted to be hosting this conversation this evening. Now, we've had over 300 delegates sign up to us, and they're still coming into the door on 4 continents and in at least 10 countries. During the program, we will be reminding you of potential donations to 2 charitable causes, one being our own, the Coburn Association, but Commissioner Silver's nominated charity is the City Parks Alliance. So please consider, if you enjoy tonight's program, to donate through the various opportunities that we will put in front of you. So without any further ado, if I could actually welcome Professor Cliff Hague, OBE, he's the chairman of the Coburn Association, and Commissioner Mitchell Silver, who's in charge of the New York City Parks and Recreation Department. And I'll hand over to Professor Hague to initiate tonight's conversation.
Okay, thank you very much, Terry. And all I would add on that is, even if you don't enjoy tonight's session, please consider making a donation to either of these 2 charities. Thanks to so many people for taking part in this. It's really a bit of an experiment for us, and it's very indicative of these days of lockdown and change working practices. But it's given us a great opportunity to do this transatlantic link. Particularly grateful, of course, to Mitch for taking part, but also to others in distant places, as well as here in Edinburgh, for joining this conversation tonight. So I wonder if we could start off, Mitchell, please, by asking you just to say a bit about yourself for those who don't know you so well, and in particular, perhaps how you came to your present job.
Well, first, I've been in the profession about 35 years. I've been a planner my entire career, and about 6 years ago, I was approached to see whether I could run the New York City park system. When I was initially contacted, I was wondering why the mayor's transition team was reaching out to me. I told them I'm a planner, and I said, if I run a parks department, it's about 80% operations and about 20% planning, and that's when the mayor said, that's why I want you. We got to rethink our park system for the 21st century. Wanted accessibility, equity, clean and safe. And after hearing the mayor's call, I decided it was time to come home. I'm originally from New York. I was in Raleigh, North Carolina for about 10 years, helping revitalize that city. I worked as a consultant in Washington, D.C. And so I felt it was the right move to make. Growing up here, I knew what the park system looked like. I was here in the 1970s when it was at its worst, and you would not even want to go in Prospect Park or Central Park. There were many movies profiling how dangerous it was. And then the city really revitalized itself through parks, but not every neighborhood benefited from that change. And so I wanted to come back to really make a difference. Prior to that, as I mentioned, I worked a lot of amazing cities in planning jobs. I have an undergraduate degree in architecture and a master's in planning. I had a good fortune of being elected president of the American Planning Association. And that's when I got an opportunity to really travel the world. We have members in over 90 countries. And I was president between 2011 and 2013 when we were coming out of our recession. And so I really had an opportunity to revitalize the planning profession to underscore how important it was. I'm now the incoming president of the American Institute of Certified Planners. So I accept that job and I start that volunteer role January 1st of 2021. I'm also a lifetime member of the Royal Town Planning Institute. And about 2 years ago, I was inducted into the fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. So I enjoy this profession. Parks is a bit different, but now I've kind of changed it to focus a lot more on planning for the future, doing work on parks equity. But now I enjoy running a very, very large park system.
That's brilliant. And I think everybody's really impressed by that career, but also by the sheer motivation of going back to do something in your hometown. And I think that's really impressive. Could you just tell us a bit what being a parks commissioner entails? It's not really a title that we have over here. And you also said, I think, that you were appointed by the mayor. So does that mean it was you were kind of directly approached by him?
That is correct. The mayor gets to appoint so-called his cabinet. In New York, you call the agency head or the department head a commissioner. That's historically what it's been called in New York City. And so I basically work for the mayor. I was appointed. My term ends December 2021. Unless the next mayor wants to reappoint me. It happens sometimes, it does not. So it's a political appointment, and it runs concurrent with the mayor's term. His term ends December 2021. My term ends December 21. In terms of what I do, I run the full agency. I report to a deputy mayor in a cluster of agencies. And so that's my direct report. The deputy mayor who then reports up to the mayor. But our role is just to run the entire system. So basically, I'm a director of an agency. I have roughly 10,000 employees when we reach our seasonal cap, but we are an essential service. Our goal is to create and sustain thriving parks and public spaces and recreational amenities for all. And our goal is to build and care for parks and public spaces for both present and future generations. So that's our mission. I have a capital budget, a 10-year budget of $5 billion. My annual operating budget is about $500 million, and that's to basically do all the work we need to do. There was a rolling slide at the beginning. We have about 12,000 hectares of parkland, of which about 4,000 hectares is just natural areas, woodlands. It could be by the water, wetlands. We have almost 2,000 parks, 1,000 playgrounds, 1,200 monuments. We have 2.6 million trees, both in our parks and our streets that we maintain. And it represents about 40%, the parks in itself represent about 44% of the city's canopy. So we actually have a forestry division that oversees all of our trees. But then we also have a business side. We run 400 concession contracts. These could include restaurants, ice skating, relationships with other park conservancies, generates about $65 million a year that gets reinvested back into our park system. Some of it goes into the city's general fund. And so with a $500 million budget, 65 million helps, but certainly if it's a conservancy park, that money gets directly reinvested into those parks so that they're sustained a lot better. My day-to-day job is very political. Run a large agency. We work directly with elected officials. Everyone wants more parks, faster, quicker. We have a whole division that designs, builds, or we contract to build all of our parks. So we have a design division, procurement division, and a construction division. And we put our contracts out there, and we have about 400 landscape architects, and engineers within the Parks Department, so we can expedite our projects. And since I've been here, we completed over 700 capital projects in 6 years. So we build it, we maintain it, and this includes new parks or refreshing older parks. So the job is intense. I don't sleep very much.
Obviously, New York's much bigger city than Edinburgh. We're only about 500,000 population in the city, but I think it's already evident from what's flicking through on the chat that some of these figures are knocking people back here. The sheer scale of the budget and the number of employees and so on. So I think it still seems much more than what's going into our parks. Can I just pick up a bit on the political relationship? And because that again is quite different, I think. You know, our officials are basically appointees largely through the officer system of the council. The political dimension is much more limited. So could you indicate any pluses and minuses of having this very direct link to the mayor? I should also add, of course, we don't really have a mayor. We have what's called a Lord Provost, who's largely a ceremonial figure, and then there's the leader of the council, who's the political figure. And in Edinburgh, for the last decade and more, it's been a sort of hung council and a coalition administration.
Well, the mayor in New York City is like the CEO, and so he runs the city, and he works through his deputy mayors and his commissioners to execute running the city. We're 8.6 million. It's a very large entity. I don't think there's any downside. In terms of our funding, it all comes from our taxes. And so the projects that get selected, I make recommendations to the mayor. The mayor has his own ideas. The city council, they also make recommendations. They have dedicated funds that they can earmark to certain park improvements. And then we have our borough presidents. They're basically county executives. And then we have our state legislators. So in New York City, parks mean so much. It's our front yard, it's our backyard. Because we're a very dense city, people thrive in parks. We cannot have a great city like New York without our park system, period. We get about 130 million visits to our parks every year. That's how important they are to New York City. For our tourism, anybody that comes here, Central Park, High Line, Prospect Park, they become destinations. Central Park alone gets 42 million visits a year. It increases real estate value. And it's a place for people to get physically healthy, but also mentally healthy. So it's about mental well-being, physical well-being. New Yorkers demand parks. They want to maintain, they want more. And we even had a coalition called Playfair last year that pushed the council to give us an additional $50 million to maintain our parks. So in New York, they're dead serious across the board, elected officials, community leaders, families, dog owners, I can go down the list. They demand an amazing park system in New York City. And if they don't, they let the mayor know.
And why do you think that is? Because we don't seem to have that here. Obviously we've got parks that are much loved, but I don't think there's ever really been that kind of political push from the general population. We'd perhaps rather take the parks for granted and let the council get on with managing them.
Well, in New York, I have this saying that people may eat and sleep in their apartments, but they live in the public realm. That's where life takes place. Walking, dining, the experience of the city happens in our public realm and in our parks. It can't happen in an apartment. There's no place to go. Not everyone has a backyard. So whether it's a large park or a small park, they're filled. They're places where people connect. They create memories. And so in New York City, they demand those places. And now during COVID, it's now the streets and the sidewalks that they're asking for a better experience. So it's just part of the identity in New York, because we have 27,000 people per square mile, which is very dense. People just don't have that access in their backyard or their front yard. And so parks serve that purpose for kids to get out, for seniors to age gracefully, where they can go out and watch people play, to sit, to enjoy the outdoors, 12 months a year, regardless of the weather. So it's just part of our culture. We demand open space. Density and open space go together, and they demand that quality open space.
Do you think Central Park has played a role in that it's such an iconic venue that is probably at the forefront of the minds of all New Yorkers and globally, of course? And do you think that helps to create the sense that all parks matter?
Yes, and coming in, we have certain parks that are run by conservancies. It's a license agreement that we basically have an arrangement where they run the park on our behalf. We give them some funds. They're able to have events and generate activities that get reinvested back in the park. But certainly Central Park caught a lot of attention because there's no other. That park costs about $65 million a year to manage. So they do a lot of that from both philanthropic giving, other giving, but also from their fees and special events. But it did set the standard that they did not want to see a great Central Park and then all the other parks in New York City not look as well. And so we launched a community parks initiative to make sure that all parks benefit from increased investment. And then the history of Central Park, now with this whole social and racial unrest, while we do say this is a great place, we also want to remind people there was a place called Seneca Village that basically the city purchased. These were a place where Black Americans lived, land was purchased, they were moved out. And so we always want to tell the good stories about Central Park, but also now we also want to tell the stories of what happened to people that got relocated in order to create this great gem. But it is by far our best park. I think the best park, I'm biased, on the planet. It is a beautiful gem, landscape architecture at display here in America. I work in Central Park. And so for me, just to see the masterpiece that Olmsted and Vox created is truly, really just a gem.
Yeah, you said, there's some controversies around that. And also you referred back to the situation in the 70s and 80s when things were not so good in New York. And I wonder, that there was some that was fairly controversial, weren't there, in the past? I think, was it Tompkins Square Park, where there was a lot of aggro in the 20, 30 years ago about displacement of people and particularly homeless people. can you maybe just fill us in a bit about that, and also how it's moved on and what your vision is for parks in the city?
Well, in terms of my vision, the top line is we want to pursue equity, access. Beyond that, any park design revolves intense public engagement. And I don't mean outreach, I mean true engagement, to listen to the stories, to understand what has been going on, to make sure that a park design does not trigger displacement. So those are some of the key things that we do. We want to make sure that the need and aspirations of that park space meets the community needs. And so we always take a look at who's in the room. If the demographics don't seem right and it's overrepresented by one group, we do our due diligence to make sure all the voices are heard, because parks are for all, and I underline all. Tompkins Square was known as Needle Park. The Lower East Side was a very bad place. That's where people used to go to shoot up drugs. It was unloved, uncared for. Over time, as we saw the evolution of parks in New York City, now people will look for their apartments or flats in proximity to the closest park, because now all the parks look amazing here in New York City. And so it's been a transformation from the 70s to the 80s. People had left New York City. We called it white flight and went out to the suburbs. But then people started returning to New York City. And that's where some of the clashes in neighborhoods happened, where those that can afford it, buildings started to be gentrified. It followed by parks being improved. And so there's always this tension between gentrification and revitalization. And it's something we try to manage very carefully. And now Tompkins Square Park is a beautiful park, accessible to all. Of course, some people unfortunately were displaced, newcomers did come in, but that's kind of the history of New York, as I'm sure as other major American cities.
Could we also talk a little bit about Bryant Park? Because I understand that there's a bandstand there, and this is something which I think is interesting to a lot of people here in Edinburgh, where, as you may know, there's been controversy about use of one of the main parks, Westminster Street Gardens, for rock concerts, which are fee-paying during the summer and during a couple of weeks of the summer. And during that period, the park is closed off for a certain time to people who haven't got tickets, and there's screening along the road that runs overlooking the park, so that people can't look in.
Well, Bryant Park is one of those parks we have a license agreement with, so they're limited in terms of what they can do. In almost all of our parks, if we have events or festivals, our recommendation, they should be free and available to the public. If they do want to charge, we max out to about 20% VIP or paid, but because parks is part of our public doctrine, public trust doctrine, we cannot privatize our parks. You can have a special event, but if there are large concerts and festivals, we encourage them to be free or require them to be free. If there's a concert, then it has to be a VIP paid portion, but it cannot really see our recommendation is 20%. So we have agreements. We control the special event permit. They have to charge a fee in order to use the space. There has to be all type of insurance requirements, because the city does not want to hold that liability. You have to make sure it's restored to either better than you found it, or at least the way you came in. But we limit what can happen, because if you do an event, you can take that park offline for months because the turf is damaged. And so we limit, even in Central Park, for our great lawn where we have our famous concerts, Paul Simon, Diana Ross, that we only have 1 or 2 per month, because we need time to replenish the lawn, plus load in, load out to get the equipment in and to get it out. You're taking that park away from the public, and we don't allow that. The parks are for all. It has to be free, and so we have very tight controls on how often someone can use it. I have a big special event staff that reviews any permits, which parks you can have concerts in, which one you can't. It has to fit into the neighborhood, and the park has to have time to breathe and heal and restore itself so the public can come back to use it. If it's raining, it's off, because we know that will truly damage the turf for a very long time for the turf to grow back. So I have a whole team that allows that studies that. We don't pay them, they pay us large fees, goes in the general fund, and those fees are quite hefty because we have to provide security from police, from our first responders. You know, all of them have to be part of the plan. And also now with Homeland Security and terrorism as a threat, we also have to have them present. So there's a lot involved in a holding event in New York. It could be, depending on the size, it could be in the millions of fees they have to pay.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And the commitment to access for people without paying is presumably part of the equity approach, the emphasis that you've got on equality and the role of the parks as a public resource and not something that is there to be exploited for the benefit of a small group.
Absolutely not. Our parks are not a commodity. If anything, they're green spaces. We have something in the United States and New York called a public trust doctrine, which means certain elements, beaches, for example, that's for the public. And we don't allow the private entity to control access to that beach because that is a natural resource for everyone. Parks and recreation now fits into that category. So if anyone tries to do even if you have a construction project in a park of more than 2 years, you're now alienating that use from the public. If anyone tries to build something in a park, it has to be alienated and you have to find a comparable or better location to replace what was lost. So the public trust doctrine is very helpful. It does guide us to some extent about our events and festivals, but they cannot be privatized. We set control limits on how it can be used because parks are for all. It is a public asset that cannot be sold. So it can be used and rented, but it has to be not rented. It can have special events for a specific time. We don't allow concerts on Central Park. It's one day. We have one Governor's Island one location where you can have a multi-day festival, but we control everything that happens. In Bryant Park, they have agreements to do a winter festival that's built into their contract, but the festival is open to everyone. They have an ice skating rink. They give away free tickets for that ice skating rink. So again, we control how much is made and then how much the public has to pay if they do, and to ensure that a lot of the benefit is free.
And is there competitive bidding for hosting such events?
Excuse me?
Do people who are putting on these events in parks bid in an open competition?
No, they don't bid. What we do is we just, every November for festivals, they know they queue up. For festivals, early November, they put in their request, and then it's first come, first serve. We evaluate it to see what works. The other ones, it's up to each conservancy to reach out to the various companies to find out what they want to do. Bryant Park has their winter festival every year. They lay down plastic, they put down the ice skating rink, and so we allow the conservancies to approach individuals, but they do know they're going to pay a fee. And they get a lot of companies. You'll see some of the signs and banners on the winter garden for them to make sure that they can offer some free services to the public. So we don't put things out there to bid. They usually just come to us, and they have their favorite parks and conservancies they go to all the time. And again, we have license agreements which limits what they can and cannot do and for how long.
And what would happen if a group of residents around a park were not happy with the arrangement, the sort of arrangement that you've said, that somebody was going to put on a festival or whatever in their park? How would you manage that kind of potential conflict, or does it just not happen?
It does happen. So in Madison Square Park, they had an annual barbecue is a big thing here in the United States. And they had this annual barbecue festival that didn't just overrun the park, it ran the streets around the park. And sadly, it was a commercial location that started transitioning to residential. And as it went to residential, the residents didn't like their having their neighborhood overrun for the weekend. The smell of barbecue pits and smoke meats, and that one came to an end. So there's another one in Prospect Park. It was called Booga Mooga. That one was very controversial. We ended that one. So we're responsive. If we hear an event that happens and it doesn't work, it's most likely not coming back again. And so we hear from the community, but so far the events that we're holding is interior to the park, like our Great Lawn. They know it's going to happen once or twice a month, the Philharmonic, other concerts, and we learn each year, and then we make some adjustments. Yeah. But if it's a problem, we will not continue that event.
It's really interesting. And again, for the benefit of people outside of Edinburgh who may not know our local context, I think it's worth just saying a few words. That we also have main public parks in the city centre. We're very fortunate that. So they're not on the scale of Central Park, but they within the city they're quite iconic. And there's been a number of controversies around them. The land is what's called public good land, which is, I think, probably similar in essence to what you've talked about, Mitch. Is, I think you called it, was it public trust or something like that?
You can Google it. Public trust doctrine is what it's called.
Yeah. So basically, these are often very old provisions that have now fallen to the city council to operate, but there's legal requirements to change from that. But what we've seen is considerable commodification, which has created a lot of concern, and particularly controversial last winter was a Christmas market held in East Princess Street Gardens, which was set up in October and ran through till I think about the 10th of January. But the damage that was done wasn't helped, admittedly, by very wet February. But hey, wet February in Scotland is not entirely earth-shattering news. And what it meant was that effectively a very substantial part of these major parks was out of commission for the public for a period, 5 or 6 months, very nearly, for a 1-month commercial festival, basically. And the
vendor have to pay for the restoration of the park?
That's not entirely clear, because we do not have, because of commercial confidentiality, the contract between the people putting on the event and the city council is not available in the public realm without heavy redactions.
Understood. So in the United States, at least in New York, it'd be very difficult to deny the public access to a park, and then when it's damaged, the public then has to pay. It's kind of a double whammy, to kind of say bluntly. So we just make sure that if someone is using our public space, that we have a contract set up front. And just, for example, COVID, we had to use East Meadow in Central Park for a makeshift hospital, and Mount Sinai knew up front they had to dig trenches for water and for electricity. I was shocked. And they agreed to pay. It's not a festival, but they agreed to restore it. All of our events have a provision that they take liability insurance in case they cannot pay so that we can cover it, but they must restore it back to better or the same as when they came in. Otherwise, the event cannot go on. We cannot go to taxpayers and saying, sorry, didn't have this for 2 months or longer to restore it. And by the way, they made the money and you'll have to pay. It's just difficult for us to explain that, and there'd be a lawsuit within a minute.
Yeah, the other bit I should have mentioned on the Christmas market is Princess Street Gardens, was it actually went ahead without getting planning permission, because it was a slightly complicated story, but in essence, the city council decided that there wasn't time for them to get a planning permission and go through the normal process. So we actually had a kind of huge unauthorized development there, which we're still now waiting for the planning application for this coming winter. But of course, who knows what's going to happen now because of COVID-19. But certainly it's been extremely controversial, and we had the Coburn Association, as many viewers at the moment will know, probably were there, put on a public summit, as we called it, back in a winter night in January, where 850 people came along, which in a city of 500,000 is quite a significant turnout. And that was really around the issue of commodification of open space. Right. And there's a general feeling, I think, that the damage that was done to the gardens, has not really been rectified in terms of whatever contracts that existed between the undertakers doing it and the city council. And the justification for it all is basically economic development, that the argument is that this brings money into the local economy, creates a number of jobs, it supports the hospitality industry. But again, that we've got some evidence that it actually competes with 365-day-a-year businesses in the area. So you have pop-up businesses coming in, hot dog stands, wine bars, things like that. So some of the spend that might otherwise go into places that have to cover their bills throughout the year is actually siphoned off for these temporary uses. So the economic equation isn't quite so clear-cut as some would have us suggest.
Well,
So,
number one, yeah, one thing, clearly we're under different political systems and different regulations, so it's always difficult to compare one country, one city to another when you're not in the same country. Number two, I think, yes, to me, I would certainly seek corporate responsibility. And even though they may say we're helping to boost the economy, I'd have to see those numbers because you're right. These events tend to take away, there's only a finite pie of spending resources, so it's going to go to one versus the other. And so lastly, you know, for corporate responsibility, you can't just look at the cost, but the value. What was the value to the public of taking that public space away from them for X period of time? I mean, as I said, parts are for physical health, they're for mental health. That there's something to it by taking away a cherished space from the public. I can't quantify the cost, but I could talk about the value. And I don't know what I would do if I didn't have access to my local park. I mean, it's what keeps me sane, going to a park. So no one looked at that cost of what it impacted local businesses, the cost of not having access to your public space. You may not have the laws, but I would call upon the corporate moral thing to do, corporate responsibility of making a donation to ensure that that park was maintained and would not be on the backs of the taxpayers.
Yeah, I think this perhaps moves us into the whole issue of COVID-19 and how the experience of recent weeks and months has affected people and also our understandings of the role of public space. And it seems to me that there's been a growing realization that the value, the social value, health value, the mental well-being value of public spaces and parks. Whether this will translate through in the recovery period to different way of managing them, I really don't know at the moment, because again, there's going to be great pressure to, in the phrase, get back to normal as soon as possible, and to try to maximize the economic flows. And this, to some extent, is understandable given the scale of unemployment that's now being predicted. But there's a great risk that unless the general public is able to articulate the case for the health and well-being benefits of public spaces, that it will just go by the board.
Well, first, I'm seeing so many great questions on the chat. I can't keep up. There's a question about Brick, my favorite park. We're not sure. I'm speaking to the leadership at Brick, I think this week, to find out what's the future. But for right now, all special events and permits are out until the end of July. Don't know if Brick come back. I'm sorry. I love it. I go there too. But I'm seeing so many good questions. Don't know if I can get to them. On COVID, Cliff, you're absolutely right. People are now beginning to see the value of parks. When this pandemic started for us, it was mid-March. Everything started to close. Shopping malls, restaurants, bars, bowling alleys, fitness clubs. The only thing that remained open were our parks. Now, we had to close amenities within our parks. The general passive parks remained open, but playgrounds, basketball, handball, tennis, all those were closed. And now we just reopened playgrounds on Monday, and we're looking at the next set, and beaches for walking only. You're right, people began to realize that parks, as I call them, became our sanctuaries of sanity. It was the only place you can go. Your shelter, we call it shelter in place. Our children were learning online. Parents had to get out. The kids had to get out. And the only place that was open for parks, and I remember I was interviewed for a New York Times article, and the reporter interviewed a woman in a park and said it kind of gives you hope because it's the only place that you can go, yes, with face covering, but now you can somewhat be free and not locked up in your apartment or your home. So people began to realize that parks were essential and vital infrastructure. Our parks employees were determined essential workers and came to work. I maybe had 5 or 6 days off since March because we had to continually keep our parks open, clean, and green, and people began to realize how important they were. So as you said, it's for both physical and mental well-being. It builds your immune system by being outdoors. And so from our point of view, we actually had to step out and do things we've never done before. We actually created a social and distancing ambassadors that went out to make sure people kept a proper physical distance. We gave them face coverings. Then we started getting involved in food distribution. But for us, people start to realize, what would we do without our parks? We knew parks weren't enough. So the mayor said we're going to have to open up some streets. And so we started closing off streets for people to walk, because not every neighborhood had a large park. And so the mayor committed up to 100 miles. I have a conversion here somewhere of what that means. So far, the mayor committed to opening up 48.3. No, he's committed to 160 kilometers of open streets. We're about halfway there, about 80 kilometers. And now the bars and restaurants that are opening up this week could now have their tables outside. So parks and open space are really going to be looked at differently now, and I think post the pandemic, when we got to start changing our attitudes about streets, giving more to people, giving more to businesses, and certainly after every pandemic, you saw this explosion of green spaces throughout the country. And that was from the 1918 pandemic. I expect the same, adding in streets and sidewalks. But people really understand the value. That is why they're upset when we're taking a $60 million budget cut. And people say, wait a minute, they've been there for us throughout this pandemic. Why are you cutting the Parks Department? I'll let the mayor and the council decide that one out. But those conversations are occurring. We are looking at a $9 billion revenue shortfall. So we understand every agency has to take a hit. We were able to do that through our contracts and avoid any layoffs. We did have to stop our seasonal hires for this summer. We don't have the full complement, so we weren't able to open our pools. We're looking to see whether we can do a few. So to me, the value of parks during the pandemic is loud and clear to all New Yorkers. Please keep them open, and now start opening up more and more assets.
But the
Dog runs and tennis were being overwhelmed with phone calls, because we open up playgrounds and people are saying our dog parks and dog runs are playgrounds for dogs. So open them up.
At the nitty-gritty level, how have you coped with things like litter and access to public conveniences, toilets? Because as people have hit the parks in Edinburgh, these have become quite important issues. The sort of mess left behind afterwards,
Right.
the fact that the council has either sold or closed most of the toilets that were associated with public spaces.
We call them comfort stations. We're keeping all of our comfort stations open. Those that were closed were in our playgrounds, because a lot of our comfort stations are within playgrounds. And a comfort station has the restrooms, the toilets, but also has a maintenance room for people to care for the park. So they're quite large. We kept them open, one, because people have to have access to the toilet. And number two, it's where people can actually wash their hands. They're cleaned, depending on the service level, once, maybe twice a day. The ones that are beaches, they get a lot higher traffic. They're cleaned multiple times a day. So we have the staff to do that. But for us, we want to make sure if people don't have hand sanitizers, that all the dispensers are filled with soap and towels and toilet paper, so that people can go in there, use those facilities, specifically when you have children. When you're a parent, those little kids can't hold it very long. Even some others, as we get older as well, need to have access to toilets. So we are keeping them open, and we're cleaning them, depends on the park, once, twice, or even more times a day.
And how far, we are much more aware now of the natural environment, biodiversity, natural ecology, issues like that. How far is that become a more central part of park management in New York?
Well, in terms of our natural resources, we have a whole division, forestry, natural resources. As I said, we have about 4,000 hectares of natural areas. We have a whole division, and we have a conservancy that helps us care for our natural areas. Our trails are there. Some, we call them Forever Wild, that just stay natural. It adds to our ecosystem and biodiversity. So we do have the locations, Pelham Bay Park, which is our largest park in New York City, 2,700 acres. I can't do the translation for hectares. By comparison, Central Park is 843. That has a lot of natural features. It's by Orchard Beach. It's wonderful. So we do maintain it. The Greenbelt in Staten Island is enormous. And so for us, in order to make sure it helps the environment, air quality, water quality, heat island effect, that our natural areas serve a great purpose. And we are seeing the return of a lot of wildlife, which some people don't like, especially raccoons. They're nasty critters.
Yeah. Okay. I've asked a lot, and I know there's a lot of people out there with questions. So I wonder if I maybe pass back to Terry and let him pick some of the questions that have come in from this huge chat that's been going on, and pick out some that we've slid over.
Thank you very much, Cliff. A most unenviable task, because as Britt said, there's a huge number of really interesting comments made. Is two pre-asked questions were about commodification and well-being, which you've covered, but it's worth noting that a question came in about the kind of roles in the transition of Central Park and Prospect Park and kind of traffic management, which you touched upon a bit, Commissioners. So it would be really good to hear a bit about that. And there's also the implications in some of the more historic plans in both cities, and how that wider strategic planning regime could affect open space or not, as the case may be.
So for both Central Park and Prospect Park was first. Our Department of Transportation initiated a traffic study to determine if the park was closed off, how would it impact the surrounding neighborhoods. And so they did a pilot over the summer to close it off to traffic to see how it worked, not just modeling, but how it happened in real time. Granted, when you do this in the summertime, people are on holiday, so you may not get a good picture. But they were confident enough by closing it off, very popular park, that you can close it off to traffic. Now, parks vehicles, emergency vehicles are allowed. And of course, if there's a concession to get to your facility, you're allowed. But other than that, it's closed off to all other traffic. And it works well. Central Park was a little bit tougher. Fifth Avenue, as you know, is a very popular location. We maintain the cross drives that basically go under. You don't interact with people. That one took a little bit longer, and that actually happened on my birthday, June 27th, about 2 years ago. So it was a great day when we closed off Central Park to traffic. Same thing, we did some modeling, and we made a determination for the first time there will be no traffic in Central Park. They've adjusted. It works well, and a little more traffic around 59th Street and Fifth Avenue, but the public and the taxi drivers adjusted, and all of that's going well.
Grand. There are a few interesting questions that kind of popped into the chat thing, which I thought I could add. Is one was, do you do any work in New York? And Cliff, you could kind of add in your experience as well here, of encouraging developers to look at dead space, or perhaps still to be developed space, turning it into kind of an open space provision, even if it's on a temporary kind of basis. And kind of another question, I'll just put a few kind of out there. The issue about maintenance and the kind of need to drive the revenue budgets, because they're always under effect. Do you have any innovative ideas on how you can kind of ensure kind of proper maintenance going forward? And there was just one little sub question about this in terms of any income from public use or from private use. Does that go directly to your parks budget in New York, or is that a general revenue?
All right, let me ask the last question first. If it is a conservancy licensed park, the revenue goes to that park and then it gets invested into the park. If it is a non-licensed conservancy park, those proceeds go into the city's general fund. So that is why some people see the inequity of having a conservancy, but it does take a lot to be able to raise enough money. Prospect Park is 10 million, Central Park is 65 million. So it takes a very strong entity we have about 8 that do that. So if you're a conservancy park, those fees, a portion comes to the city. For the most part, is reinvested back into the park. If it's a non-conservancy park, it goes into our general fund. On maintenance, I have a whole division called Innovation and Performance Management. Our goal through analytics is to figure out how we maintain our parks. We have 2 ways of maintaining parks. We have a fixed crew that stays in that park if it's large enough, Central Park, Prospect Park, Madison Square, and then we have mobile crews for the rest. About 70-80% of our parks have mobile crews. They go from site to site, and they have service levels to clean it, and they eat once a week, twice a week, 3 times a week, depending on the amount of traffic and visitors they get. We optimize the routes by using technology, so we know what the size of the crew should be, how we optimize it, And then we have definitely enough funds to do it. Then we have inspectors that go around. We meet monthly as kind of a park stat. So we have service levels we have to meet from the mayor's office, and anything that drops below, we have to kind of call the regional manager in to find out what's going on. So for us, we meet all the mayor's targets for cleanliness, for condition, anything they find into the park. We call it IA, immediate action. It goes out to the team and they have 24 hours to rectify it, specifically if it's some danger to playground equipment, because we do not want any children getting hurt. So we're recognized for our parks improvement program. It's called PIP. We do ratings. We have inspectors that inspect parks twice a year, every year, and that guides us into what we need to do. And if we have to make adjustments because we see some maintenance shortfalls, we'll make those adjustments. I know there was one other about developers in private space. We don't have a lot of space in New York. We have used park space while it's waiting for construction. 50 Kent Street, for example, in Williamsburg, is now just one big lawn with picnic tables. And so if there's a space in our system, we don't have money to improve the park yet, what we will do is find a creative way of opening it up to the public. If a developer wants to do that, they can do that. They assume the liability and the maintenance. We're okay with that. But there's not a lot of vacant land in New York. And so, and I guess there are cases here and there where developer will do something in a property to, attract some energy, some experience that could take place. But there's not a lot of that in New York. Not a lot of vacant land.
Okay. And there's been a few questions and a variety of bits around your comments about access and the fact that parks are for all. And the questions are really around, do you have a mechanism for actually calculating how you measure that kind of value, the public
Yes.
value of spaces, and how you put that into a cost-benefit equation for considering either investment or whether you allow a major event, etc.?
In terms of value, this is a difficult one. We can count how many people, for the most part, we're using cell phone data. We now have apps for staff at the beach that can tell us how many people are coming in. But I said earlier, it's cost versus value. If someone comes to me and say, why should I give you money versus the fire department? I tell them, look, it's about the value. What is the cost of a child in an impoverished neighborhood, underserved, that does not have access to a quality park and can't play? How does that affect his childhood? A child with autism that can now go into a public space for the first time and laugh because we have universally accessible play equipment. Or a senior citizen who for the first time does not have to navigate very difficult terrain just to go in a park and have some green space. We keep looking for the cost. I'm looking for the value. Great cities are made by great parks. Places that are livable, it's about great parks in all neighborhoods. So from my point of view, we have to understand to create great cities require quality neighborhoods, quality public spaces. I can't put a cost on that, but I know when that park is closed, like now during COVID, people are losing their minds. They realize the value of having a green space where they can create memories, they can get healthy, they can both physically and mentally, they connect as friends. How do you put a dollar value on that? So I think we're boxed in by a lot of elected officials by a cost benefit analysis. I can't put a cost that now that child who's autistic and could not play in a park is now laughing and enjoying themselves. I can't put a value on that. Or there's one story I share very often that we opened up a park. We do all these community park initiatives. We have about 200 parks that hadn't seen investment in over 20 years. No investment. They look horrible. And so the mayor gave me over $300 million to transform 67 of these 200 parks. There was one park in particular in Brooklyn. This was your typical asphalt playground, had nothing, baseball lines and all the field lines were just painted yellow on black asphalt, and we changed it. Synthetic turf, running track, flowers, shrubs, play equipment, and it's always hard for me to say this, but on opening day, there's a little boy, he was Latino, Hispanic, about 8 years old, and we were doing a ribbon cutting, and he wouldn't go in the park. He would not go in the park. And so one of my park workers went to him and said, why won't you come into the park? And a little boy said, I didn't come in the park because I didn't know how much it cost. It looked so nice, he thought he had to pay. And now his life's gonna change. I can't put a cost on that, but I can tell you the value that that child and every child in that neighborhood They now have a quality park, and he didn't think he can go into that because it looks so nice. He would have to pay and go in. That to me is what gets to me. That's why I do this work. And that's the importance of getting away from cost versus value. To not have a quality space throughout the city and be deprived for 20 years of not having quality space is something that just bothers me. So we talk about cost versus value, go beyond the dollars and talk about the livability, the memories you're creating for that child versus leaving it as a dump or creating a world-class space that they can thrive, connect with friends, get healthy, and be good citizens. Cost value, I'm sorry I get emotional about this one, but when I hear that, it really, really just gets to me.
Yeah, I'm sure if we didn't have everybody muted, there'd be a lot of cheering going on, which would be fantastic. In relating to that, we have a query from somebody in Canada, which covers in kind of a UK. So Cliff, I'd like to get your response to this as well, where the question is about other important uses such as affordable housing or subsidized kind of housing, where a view could be taken of saying, well, public land is cheaper and the need for housing is absolutely critical. So isn't that an acceptable trade-off, or how do you begin balancing those competing public needs?
No, to me, giving away parkland for development is like giving away your inheritance. So if you want to give away your inheritance, you give it away, it's very hard to get back. We can't have these competing values against one another. I don't look for affordable housing. I look for affordable neighborhoods, complete neighborhoods. And part of that is to have access to services, transportation, and quality open space. So you cannot have one against the other. They're mutually exclusive. They have to go together. If you want affordable housing without quality neighborhoods, without quality parks, then you're not creating a decent affordable housing, because that goes with it. And not little leftover space in some new project that gives them some access to space, but not quality open space. So I'd push back and I'd find other places that could be redeveloped, but parkland is sacred. That's why I love the public trust doctrine. It is sacred. Once that park space is created, that natural resource, that is sacred. And I just have a hard time people saying we're giving away our inheritance because we have to meet some other need. There are locations, there are always locations. That's regeneration, revitalization, there are other opportunities to do, but I could not in clear conscience give away that gem, that inheritance in order to fill to somewhat of a short-term need.
Brilliant. Cliff,
and
do you want to come in?
Housing is a short-term need, but my point is, once you take green space away, you can't get it back. You can't. You have to take something down, and it's happening in India and other places for commerce, and the people are going crazy. Where are my kids going to play? So they're playing in the street. They're playing in the street. That's now their new park, a dirt street, and I have a problem with that. And so you have to figure out other ways of maintaining. Even the Sustainable Development Goals talk about the importance of having public space and open space. It's something 11.7, you can read it, the value of having that public space, and to take it away to me breaks my heart.
Yeah, I think the point that Mitch made there, that when it's gone, is really fundamental. And what we've seen in UK, I think over 20 years probably, is a period of underinvestment in public space, very tight restrictions on local government finance. And out of that, there's a huge temptation to, on the one hand, let public parks and public spaces deteriorate, but on the other hand, the potential to release the value of the site by letting development take place on it. But as I say, once it's gone, it's gone. And I think we should realize that it's not inevitable that a council doesn't have any money, that the value of the park is there for all time. And so it's this kind of vicious circle I think we've often got into, whereby it's said that the quality of the park is such that it's not really that important. It can be released, and we all know that affordable housing is desirable, but in our situation, again, there's lots of hurdles over actual getting delivery of affordable housing. Well, I think, yeah. Can I maybe just take this on a bit and ask Mitch, what about new areas in all cities? Almost inevitably, parts, like all other infrastructure, are largely historical legacy. We're the beneficiaries of long-sighted decisions by generations before us. But how do you go about getting new parks or good quality open space in new residential developments, for example?
Well, it depends where it's located. We have open space provisions. So it's by the waterfront. It's already been mapped out that any development on the waterfront must provide open space. We reserve the water's edge and not let a developer to build at the water's edge. We want to give the best land to the public for public access. Developer, you can put it behind that public access. Now it increases the value of their property versus putting it right up against the street. And I'm not talking about maybe 100 yards. We're talking deeper. Quality park, open space along the water's edge. Development can then go behind it. So that's a provision on a lot of our waterfront. We have other open space standards per project. So it varies based upon our zoning. So that's something that's quite critical. I do want to make another point about diminish of open space. There are studies all over that when you do not care for public spaces, you start to see crime increase, anxiety, and stress. So if you want to start closing your parks, be prepared to see some mental health issues. In fact, people being locked up here are experiencing some mental health issues. They can't get to quality open space. So if the elected officials really care about the mental health of their public, we have seen when you close parks where they lack open space, it's higher crime, anxiety, and stress. And when they are built, like in Philadelphia, they started looking at all their vacant lots and greened them. Within a matter of time, based upon the study, crime down, anxiety down, stress down. So those are other factors that when you don't have open space and everything is just a built environment, I just want my brain to breathe somewhere. Where can my brain relax for a couple of seconds? I'm sorry, it's that housing development over there took away your green space. And then where do you go? Where do you go? There's a therapeutic value of being in green space. You know, it's like the first healthcare worker at parks. You know, you just need them. And so that's something that we're going to push very hard, that they actually take care of you. And so just want to put that out there as well to my other point. Now I lost the other question, but that's okay. I feel good right now.
I think you've taken us kind of down kind of quite a fascinating road on that. Anyway, clearly there's so many questions still kind of coming in at the moment through the kind of chat feed. I don't think that we can really do kind of justice, and we're probably nearing an end to the kind of time we had. But I thought I'd just kind of share some of the comments that have come in as opposed to questions. I have to say that there's an awful lot of green envy I'm kind of picking up from not just here in kind of Edinburgh, but from other parts of the world and other parts of the UK as well. And I think there's been any number of people who've been asking the question, or at least noting, do you fancy moving to kind of Edinburgh to give a hand to kind of us? So there's an invitation kind of open to you for that. It's noted, at least in and maybe you might have a view kind of on this, that in kind of Edinburgh, many parks or green spaces actually have friends groups established, and they play an important role in working with decision making and providing advice to kind of officials and I guess kind of local councils. Is that something that you have in New York, that kind of
Yes.
citizen network of organizations?
We have about 600 friends groups of our 2,000 parks. They help raise funds, they hold programs, they have cleanups, and they're advocates for more park funding. So it's called Partnership for Parks. It's a huge network. And so they do the special programming, whether it's a reading room in the park, they just do events, small events, but very local, hyper-local events. So that is something that's very key to us. But on average, we engage about 600 friends groups of various sizes. So that's key to the work that we do. And the volunteer work is absolutely amazing. We actually have numbers about how many volunteers and volunteer hours. It is enormous. There are some places in the United States that get nervous that the volunteer groups are taking the jobs away from unionized park workers. We haven't found that to be the case. So we talk about caring, and these people come out because they care. Why would you spend your Saturday planting, raking, painting if you didn't care? The local park means a lot to them, and they're of all ages. In Astoria Park, there's a little boy, about 10 years old. He wears a park's uniform, and he's out there every Saturday. He's going to have to be the next commissioner, I hope. But it's the stewardship of saying that we're going to work side by side the Parks Department to really help steward this park.
Fantastic. And I think before I can hand over to each of you to maybe have your final soapbox little little statement going forward. A question kind of on my mind, Mitch, for you in terms of the mixture. I certainly know what it's like here, but when you come up for a local election, would you find candidates using green space and green space credentials as being an important plank in their platforming?
Yes, in New York, you're going to hear schools, parks, and libraries. Now the big issue, of course, is police, the criminal justice system, let me just say that, in law enforcement. The schools, parks, libraries, those tend to be the community assets and includes our recreation centers and community centers. Those get talked about quite a bit because those are the magnets when people come together. Our protests are all in parks. Major gatherings are all in parks. We're having, as you know, I think it's about almost 30 consecutive days of protests here in New York, and they're all happening in our parks. So it is talked about, and they're very clear because people ask them. They know what parks means in New York City. So that tends to be part of the conversation. Now, of course, it's dealing with the racial, social injustice and what's happening out of criminal reform and about the term is defund police. It's not defund them, but can you shift some of $1 billion of your $6 billion budget to other resources? And that's a conversation, like I said, is between the mayor and the city council. So yes, it is now a conversation, and people are going to start running for city council next year. They turn over about every 4 years, so the next turnover is going to happen next year.
Fantastic. So I think as we come to the denouement of this is just while I have you in front of me, Mitch, do you have any kind of final thoughts or comments, come out of this conversation for us all to take away with us? What would they be?
Well, for one, I'm just going to underscore the value of parks and public space. I don't like to talk it in terms of cost, but about value. It's changing people's lives. These are vital. It's not just a nice amenity. For us, we use it for air quality, for water quality, stormwater collection, so it has a whole climate change purpose. It is now serving a social gathering purpose. As we see all these races and strife, they're all coming together in our public spaces. These are places where people go to feel alive, to connect, to create memories, but also to get healthy, both physically and mentally. So parks to me are vital to an essential city. And it's not just a side amenity. A city who does that truly undervalues not only the parks, but the people who live there. People now are looking for proximity to public space to have a meaningful lifestyle. Whether you're a child, a teenager, a young couple, or you're elderly, it serves an incredible purpose 12 months out of the year. So I get concerned when people don't see the value. They look at the cost and not the value. So if there's one thing I had to underscore, start thinking about the value and not the cost. And I think once you craft that, you'll be able to compete with all those money-making entities. And there's ways you can be creative where you can come up with a structure that they can be revenue generating, but for the city. And it could, whether there are some cities that dedicate it just to their park system, like Chicago and Minneapolis, where they have their own taxing authority to maintain their parks, or there's some dedicated funds through conservancies to be reinvested back in the park. If there's a will, political will, there's a way. We just have to be determined to make sure that you value park space importantly. And Edinburgh, I'm sure, can get it right.
That's brilliant. Thank you,
Cliff. We're having this conversation, so apparently, Edinburgh is about 500,000. That's about the size of Raleigh. So when I go there, I'll be right at home. So Cliff will work on that visit so I can come over there when COVID is over and we can just hang out at a social distance.
Well, I certainly look forward to that, Mitch. And I think, my final comments tonight, I think a couple of things. One, that we now are, I think we all recognize, entering rather uncharted territory as the pandemic has swept through our societies, changing, as we've said, so many assumptions and ways of doing things. And none of us quite knows what's going to come next or how we move forward. But what I think we've heard tonight is very strong endorsement of the idea that we put to the value of public spaces and parks right at the top of that agenda, that we don't let it be dominated by the kind of calculus and figures that are put forward for GDP and so on. Yes, there are going to be huge problems in terms of unemployment and loss of income, but I think we also need to look at our parks as a way to redress some of those challenges. and make sure that socially useful work is done there and environmental benefits are gained. And I think what this evening has shown us as well is the absolute value of sharing expertise internationally. I think it's just wonderful that we've had this chance to talk with Mitch and to hear his passion and great experience. And it's really, I think, a lesson for us all that Edinburgh, capital city of Scotland, really needs to reach out to other parts of the world and see how they handle parks, how they handle housing, how they handle traffic, how they handle the growth of their city and the quality of their city. And unless we do that, we risk getting trapped in our own narrow way of doing things, which has been leading us, I think, down a very unfortunate path in recent years, as some of the examples we've talked about tonight, I think, has shown. I really regret that we haven't had a chance to pick up all the questions. As Mitch says, you know, I've had them flashing up on the right-hand side.
I know. I do want to make one final point. And Edinburgh, I have to start getting the pronunciation right. My daughter, actually, for her graduation, selected Edinburgh as the place she wanted to go to. So you will see me in the summer of 2022 when she graduates. I just want to emphasize this cost and value. And I remember my father, he passed away in 2010. And we were debating, should he stay at home or should we look at the quality of life as he passed? And so that's where cost and value came in. It was going to cost more with at-home care, but the value was that he got to live his last life the way he wanted to. Cost versus value. And that's how I look at that equation. I get very frustrated when someone talks to me about the cost, because to me, we didn't really care. The value of watching my father pass and transition the way he wanted to, around his wife and his children, at home, where he was familiar with that space, was worth the cost. Because the value was that he could be at peace, the entire family could be at peace. So when you have this conversation about green space, think about cost versus value, and you have to figure out how to articulate that. And I'm confident that when you make that right argument, who could not be moved and appealed by looking at parks and green space that way? It's not just the cost, it's the value. And you have to have a community conversation to find out exactly what that is and why that means so much to the people of Edinburgh.
Yeah, I think you've articulated it brilliantly. But on behalf of the Coburn Association, I would say that we've been trying to do that for, 145 years now. That the organization was set up basically to resist some of the crazy things that were being suggested back in the 1840s, 1850s. The organization set up after that, but the same situations have arisen time and time again. And I know Terry's looked much more than I have at the early minutes and that of the association, but what we see is back in the 1870s, the 1880s, parks and trees and open space are absolutely central to the campaigning of the Coburn. And to some extent, the city we have now with the open space we have now reflects the achievements of that association, of our forefathers who ran it before us. And we very much hope that we can keep this effort going. We rely upon the support of our members and volunteers, which we're very grateful for. But tonight's been a wonderful opportunity to connect our stories with those from New York in particular, but also, as we've seen, from many different countries across the world. So thanks to everybody for your participation tonight. And we hope that this won't be the last of these types of events. We certainly will look forward to hosting Mitch and his family when they come over in a couple of years' time. So
Brilliant.
Thank you.
And I think on behalf of all of us, thank you very much, and for the rest of the Coburn team, for DJ, Lucy and James for making this happen. And a final reminder that if you haven't done so, please consider making a donation, which we'll share with the City Parks Alliance, who are America's premier advocates for urban parks, a really good cause, and ourselves as well, to help us continue our work. Become a member for us. Whatever we could raise tonight, we share equally with City Parks Alliance. And thank you very much. We have recorded this. We will be publishing it up on our kind of YouTube kind of website, and we'll capture kind of all of the comments and kind of synthesize it into being at least a kind of a summary of tonight's kind of event. But I think for everybody who's kind of attended, again, thank you very much, Professor Cliff Hague and Commissioner Mitchell Silver. It's been a most stimulating evening. And take care and keep safe.
Thank you. All of you as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks again. Good night, everybody.